The lecture hall of the Galactic Interspecies Academy smelled like burnt ozone, alien sweat, and the specific kind of arrogance that only comes from someone who has never, not once in their entire career, been genuinely surprised by anything. Professor Kraeth Voss stood at the front of the room with the energy of a being who had given this exact speech 417 times, and was absolutely certain he would give it 418 more before anyone dared to question him. He was tall, unreasonably tall. His species, the Veldrathian, were known across 17 star systems for three things: their 4 arms, their iridescent violet skin, and their absolutely insufferable habit of being right about everything, which they would remind you about constantly, in great detail, with visual aids. Today, the visual aid was a holographic projection of a small, pale blue planet spinning lazily in the center of the room. Earth, Professor Kraeth announced, his voice carrying that particular tone usually reserved for people who are about to tell you your favorite food is objectively inferior. Class designator, Deathworld, Category 7. 43 students from 31 different species stared at the projection. Some took notes. Some blinked their various numbers of eyes. One, a Florian from the gas clouds of Petra 9, simply vibrated nervously, which for Florians was basically the equivalent of leaning forward with popcorn. Sitting in the third row, almost invisible between a 6-limbed Chorath named Duvak and a towering Mekari who went by the name Beloth, was Petra Solano. She was human. She was also the only human in the room, which meant she was currently the subject of Professor Kraeth's visual aid, his lecture, and his deeply unearned confidence. She had short hair the color of dark wood, a jacket that had seen better decades, and the expression of someone who had just watched a stranger confidently mispronounce their own name. She didn't say anything. She just listened. She was very good at listening. Humans usually were, right up until they weren't. I have personally conducted field research on Earth, Professor Kraeth continued, clicking his secondary arms together in what Veldrathians considered a gesture of authority and everyone else considered deeply unsettling. 3 expeditions, 3 successful extractions, and I will tell you, with complete academic certainty, that the reputation of humans as a warrior species is, to put it as politely as my credentials allow, dramatically exaggerated. Duvak, the Chorath beside Petra, shifted his 6 limbs and glanced sideways at her. Petra did not glance back. She was writing something in her notebook. What she was writing nobody could see, but she was pressing down hard enough that the desk was probably feeling it. Humans, Kraeth said, pulling up a series of biological data charts that floated in the air like glowing insults, are fragile. Their skeletal structure is inadequate for combat by galactic standards. Their pain tolerance, while slightly above average, has been documented and is manageable. Their psychological resilience, while interesting on paper, collapses under sufficient pressure. He paused. Dramatically. Because of course he did. I know this because on my second expedition to Earth, I engaged in a direct confrontation with 3 human security personnel. I neutralized all 3 in under 4 minutes. The room murmured. Beloth the Mekari made a low rumbling sound of impressed approval. Petra's pen stopped moving. The exaggeration of human capability, Kraeth went on, warming to his subject the way a fire warms to a pile of old dry wood, is a cultural myth perpetuated by species who have never actually faced them in controlled conditions. They are not invincible. They are not uniquely dangerous. They are, at best, a mildly inconvenient Category 7 species who live on a mildly hostile planet and have convinced themselves through sheer audacity that this makes them special. He smiled. It was a very wide smile. The Veldrathian had a lot of teeth. Any questions? Silence. Then, from the third row, a hand went up. 1 hand, 5 fingers, belonging to the only human in the room. Professor Kraeth looked at Petra the way you look at a dessert spoon that has somehow ended up in the soup course. Curious, slightly annoyed, utterly unthreatened. Yes, he said, the human. Petra lowered her hand. The 3 security personnel, she said. Her voice was calm, conversational, even. The kind of calm that weather reports describe right before they tell you to seek shelter. What were their names? Kraeth blinked 2 of his 4 eyes. I beg your pardon? Their names. The 3 humans you neutralized in 4 minutes. Do you know what they were called? A pause. That is not relevant to the academic discussion. Interesting, Petra said, and she wrote something else in her notebook. Kraeth stared at her for a moment, recalibrated, and moved on. The cafeteria of the Galactic Interspecies Academy was a marvel of culinary engineering, designed to serve 400 different dietary requirements across 60 species without poisoning anyone, which it managed approximately 89% of the time. The other 11% kept the medical wing busy and gave students excellent stories. Petra sat alone at a table near the observation window, eating something that was technically described as a protein composite, but looked like someone had given up halfway through inventing food. She was still writing in her notebook. Duvak slid into the seat across from her. For a Choroth, this was a complicated process involving all 6 limbs and a certain amount of reorganization, but he managed it. "You should not have done that," he said without preamble, because Choroth were not a species that believed in social warm-up time. "Done what?" Petra asked. "Asked about the names. I was curious." "You were not curious," Duvak said, with the particular certainty of someone who has been paying attention. "You were measuring him." Petra looked up from her notebook. She had remarkable eyes, the kind that made you feel, briefly and uncomfortably, like you were the one being studied. He said he neutralized 3 humans. "Yes. On Earth. Yes." Without anyone stopping him. Duvak's 6 fingers twitched in a Choroth gesture that translated, roughly as, "Yes, I see where this is going, and I am not sure I want to go there." His field research is classified as academic in nature. He had permits. The Galactic Academic Council granted access. "I know," Petra said. "I read the permit documentation." She paused. "All 47 pages of it." Duvak stared at her. "When did you read 47 pages of academic permit documentation?" "Last night. It was published this morning." "I read fast." There was a silence. Duvak ate something from his tray that made a sound like a polite argument. "What are you going to do?" he asked finally. "I'm going to go back to class," Petra said. "Finish the semester, take the exams." She closed her notebook. "And then I'm going to file a formal grievance with the Academic Council's Ethics Division regarding the professor's field research methodology." Duvak blinked 3 of his 4 eyes. "That is unexpectedly procedural of you." "I'm a very procedural person. The Ethics Division review takes 8 months minimum." "I know. Kraeth will have retired by then." "I know," Petra said again, and she smiled, and it was the kind of smile that made Duvak suddenly very grateful he was not Professor Kraeth Voss. "But the review will be public record, and public record is permanent." She picked up her protein composite and took a bite of it with the energy of someone who had already won an argument that hadn't started yet. The next lecture was 3 days later, and by then the story had gotten around. The Galactic Interspecies Academy was a large institution, but gossip in large institutions travels at speeds that put most faster-than-light communication to shame. By the time Petra walked into the lecture hall on the morning of advanced xenobiology, at least 30 students from various species had heard some version of the story, and the version most of them had heard was, the human asked Kraeth about names, and he didn't have an answer, and it was extremely uncomfortable for everyone. This was, largely, accurate. Professor Kraeth was already at the front of the room when Petra arrived. He watched her take her seat in the 3rd row with the expression of a being who had decided, officially, that she was a minor inconvenience, and not, under any circumstances, a genuine challenge to his authority. He was wrong about this. Today's lecture was on biological adaptation in high-pressure environments, which was relevant to approximately 12 of the 43 students and theoretically interesting to the rest. Kraeth moved through it with his usual confidence, projecting diagrams and speaking with the authority of someone who had written 7 books and was not going to let you forget it. 40 minutes in, he pulled up a new holographic display. It showed a human skeleton. "Since we have," he said, with the faint smile of a man setting a trap he was certain would work, "a living specimen available for reference, let us use this opportunity to examine the structural limitations of Homo sapiens in practical terms." He looked at Petra. The room looked at Petra. Petra looked at the holographic skeleton. Then she looked at Kraeth. "You want me to stand up so you can use me as a visual aid?" "I want you to contribute to the academic discussion," he said, smoothly. "Surely you have no objection to education?" "None at all," Petra said, and she stood up. She was not particularly tall. She was not by any visible measure physically imposing. She stood in the 3rd row of a classroom full of beings from 31 species, most of whom were larger than her, and she looked, to be entirely honest, like someone who had wandered in from a coffee shop, but she stood like she owned the floor she was standing on. And when she looked at Kraeth, she looked at him the way mountains look at weather. "You said humans have inadequate skeletal structure," she said. "Compared to what reference species?" Kraeth's smile held. the Galactic Combat Standard, which is based on a composite of 17 species, which 17, that is standard academic reference material, available in any basic xenobiology text. I've read the text, Petra said. The 17 species in the Combat Standard composite have an average body weight of 430 kilograms. Humans average around 70. You're comparing structural adequacy across a 6-to-1 mass differential without controlling for weight-to-strength ratio, impact distribution, or skeletal flexibility under load. She tilted her head. That's not a limitation, that's a category error. The room was very quiet. Beloth the Mechari, who had been nodding along to Kraeth's lecture for 40 minutes, stopped nodding. Kraeth opened his mouth. Also, Petra added pleasantly, the study you're pulling the pain tolerance data from was conducted using Veldrathian nerve stimulus parameters. Veldrathian nerve endings are approximately 40% less dense than human nerve endings per square centimeter, which means the stimulus levels used in the study were calibrated for a fundamentally different nervous system. The humans in that study weren't demonstrating manageable pain tolerance. They were being understimulated by a poorly designed methodology. She paused. That's in the supplementary data. Page 93. It's easy to miss if you're reading quickly. The silence in the room had now achieved a specific texture. It was the silence of 42 non-human students, who were suddenly paying very close attention to something that had been, until this moment, a one-sided lecture. Professor Kraeth Voss, who had given this lecture 417 times, had never had anyone respond to it like this. He looked at Petra, his forearms stilled, his violet skin shifted slightly in tone, a Veldrathian response to adrenaline that his species called the shimmer and that everyone else called a tell. You have clearly done some reading, he said, with the measured calm of someone who is restructuring rapidly behind a maintained expression. I read fast, Petra said, sitting back down. Nevertheless, anecdotal correction of established academic literature is not the same as practical evidence. The fact remains that I have direct field experience with human subjects under real conditions. The 3 security personnel, Petra said. Yes. Whom you neutralized in 4 minutes. Correct. Petra picked up her pen. What were their names? Kraeth stared at her. I asked you 3 days ago, she said, and her voice was still calm, still conversational, still carrying that particular quality that was starting to make the entire room lean forward. You said it wasn't relevant. I've been thinking about it, and I disagree. If you neutralized 3 people, 3 specific human beings, in a direct confrontation on their home planet, you had their names on your research permit application. The permit's a public record. I checked. She opened her notebook. The 3 humans listed as research subjects on your second Earth expedition were Thomas Vara, age 52, retired logistics coordinator, Bereni Solis, age 39, administrative security officer, on duty only because the scheduled officer called in sick, and Kwame Adisa, age 24, who was on his second week of work and, based on the post-expedition medical report you submitted, had never been in a physical confrontation in his life. The room did not breathe. You neutralized a logistics coordinator, a desk officer, and a 24-year-old on his second week of work, Petra said, and you've been giving this lecture about human physical inadequacy, using that as your primary field evidence for how long? Kraeth said nothing. 14 years, Petra said, answering her own question, because she had clearly anticipated that he wouldn't. 14 years, 417 lectures, to students from 62 species, many of whom went on to careers involving direct contact with human populations. She closed her notebook. I looked that up too. The Florian in the back row vibrated so hard it briefly levitated. Kraeth Voss, professor of xenobiology, author of 7 books, holder of 3 academic chairs across 2 star systems, stood at the front of his lecture hall, and for the first time in 14 years, he had absolutely nothing to say. I'll sit down now, Petra said. Sorry for the interruption. She sat down. She picked up her pen. She started writing. And somewhere in the 3rd row of the Galactic Interspecies Academy's Advanced Xenobiology Lecture Hall, surrounded by 42 aliens from 31 species, a human girl smiled very quietly at her notebook. The professor had made a mistake. He had made a very simple, very common, very old mistake. He had looked at a human and seen something small. The ethics division of the Galactic Academic Council occupied an entire floor of the Vathara Station administrative complex, which floated in a comfortable orbit above the neutral zone between 3 interstellar territories. It was the kind of place that smelled like recycled air and bureaucratic patience, where the carpets were a color specifically chosen to discourage urgency, and where things moved at the speed of paperwork, which is to say slowly, deliberately, and with absolutely devastating effect. The filing was submitted on a Tuesday. By Wednesday, it had been logged. By Thursday, it had been assigned a reference number. By the following Monday, Professor Kraeth Voss had received a formal notification that a grievance had been filed against his field research methodology, his classroom conduct, and, in a supplementary addendum that had taken someone considerable effort to write, the epistemological integrity of his published body of work. The supplementary addendum was 41 pages long. Petra had written it over the weekend. She did not sleep much. This was, for the record, a very human thing. News of the filing spread through the academy with the same speed and enthusiasm that all genuinely good gossip achieves. By Tuesday of the following week, Duvak had received 17 separate communications from Chorath acquaintances across 4-star systems, asking if the human girl in the xenobiology class was real or a fictional character someone had invented for dramatic effect. He responded to all 17 with the same message: she is real, she reads fast. Do not underestimate her. Makari had not spoken in class since the lecture. He sat in his usual seat and watched Petra, with the cautious attention of a very large creature who has recently recalibrated its understanding of which things in a given room are dangerous. This was for a Makari, a significant behavioral adjustment. Makari did not recalibrate easily. Their skulls were very thick, and their opinions were very fixed, and changing either required substantial force. Petra had managed it with a notebook and a pen. Nobody said this out loud, but everyone was thinking it. Professor Kraeth did not appear for the next scheduled lecture. A substitute arrived instead. Her name was Instructor Vale, a Chorath academic of middle years and considerable patience, who looked at the 43 students seated in front of her, looked at the empty chair in the third row, looked back at the 43 students and said, with admirable composure, "We will be covering atmospheric biology today. Please open your secondary course materials." The empty chair in the third row was because Petra was not in the classroom. She was, at that precise moment, sitting in a small office on the 4th floor of the Academy's administrative wing, across a desk from a Veldrathian bureaucrat named Sereth, who had the expression of someone who had read things this morning that they had not expected to read this morning, and were now regretting their career choices. "Miss Solano," Sereth said, for the third time, because apparently saying it twice had not been sufficient to fully process the situation. "You understand that a formal grievance of this scope typically takes 8 to 10 months to complete a preliminary review." "Yes," Petra said. "The supplementary addendum you submitted references 214 separate academic papers." 216, Petra said. "I added 2 more on Sunday evening." Sereth looked at the documentation on his desk. He looked at it the way you look at something that has grown while you weren't watching. "The papers you cite include 3 that were published within the last 14 days. They were relevant. One of them," Sereth said slowly, "is authored by Professor Kraeth Voss himself. You are using his own published research to contradict his own published research." Page 44, Petra confirmed. He contradicts himself between the 2019 and 2031 editions of his field methodology textbook. The 2031 edition updates the nerve density data. He updated it himself. He just never updated the lecture notes. She paused. "Or the lecture." Sereth set down the documentation carefully, the way you set down something fragile that has surprised you by being heavier than expected. He was quiet for a long moment. "Miss Solano," he said finally, "may I ask you something informally?" "Sure." "Why?" Petra looked at him. "Why what? Why this? Why the detail? Why the 41 pages? Why the 216 papers?" He was not being hostile. He was being genuinely curious, which from a bureaucrat was the most honest thing you could ask for. Professor Kraeth is not the first academic to overstate conclusions from limited field data. He will not be the last. The 3 humans from his second expedition are on public record. They are alive. They have presumably continued their lives. Why does this matter enough for 41 pages? Petra was quiet for a moment. Outside the office window, the station's viewport showed stars. A lot of stars. The kind of view that usually made humans feel small. Petra did not look small. She never looked small. It was increasingly clear that this was a conscious choice. "Tomas Vara retired from logistics at 52, she said. "He probably had a going-away party, Someone probably baked a cake. He spent his whole career moving things from one place to another and making sure the numbers added up, and he was good at it. And then he retired, and one day an alien professor with academic permits showed up and used him as a data point. She paused. He didn't agree to be a data point. He agreed to be a research subject, which is different, and even that consent was obtained under terms that the permit documentation describes in language a logistics coordinator with no legal background would have found very difficult to pass. Kraeth said nothing. Bereni Solis was covering for a colleague, Petra continued. She was there by accident. Her name is in 14 years of lectures as evidence of human physical inadequacy. She has never heard that lecture. She doesn't know. Another pause. Kwame Adisa was 24. He was 2 weeks into his first professional job. He was probably still figuring out where the good coffee was. She looked at Sereth with those unremarkable eyes that were somehow, in this office, on this station, in this conversation, becoming harder and harder to look away from. Kraeth stood in front of students from 62 species and told them that humans are manageable, that we're fragile, that our reputation is myth, and he used 3 specific people, 3 people with names and ages and going away parties and favorite coffee spots, as his proof. And then he gave that lecture 417 times. She picked up her bag. Those students went on to careers. Some of them are in positions where they make decisions about human populations. Some of them were told, in their formative academic years, by a credentialed professor with field research, that we are not a threat worth taking seriously. She stood up. That's not an exaggerated reputation, she said. That's a security risk, for us. And 41 pages seemed about right for a security risk. She left. Sereth sat at his desk for a very long time after she was gone, looking at the documentation, and then at the viewport full of stars, and then at the documentation again. Then he picked up his communication terminal and requested a priority scheduling review. 8 to 10 months became 6 weeks. The hearing was held in the Vithara Station formal chamber, which had excellent acoustics and was usually reserved for treaty negotiations and high-level academic disputes. Using it for a grievance hearing against a single professor was, technically, unusual. The council had decided, after reviewing the supplementary addendum, that unusual was appropriate. Kraeth arrived with 2 legal representatives and the expression of someone who has convinced themselves they are going to be fine, which is an expression that tends to appear most frequently right before someone is not fine. Petra arrived with Duvak, who was there as a character witness and had been given by Petra a list of 4 things he was permitted to say and 11 things he was not. She also brought her notebook, a second notebook as backup, and a small printed copy of the 41-page addendum that she did not technically need because she had memorized it. The presiding officer was a Veldrathian named Councillor Merith, who was about as impartial as it was possible for a being to be while still being the same species as the subject of the grievance. She had read the addendum twice. Her skin did not shimmer. She was very practiced at not letting it. The hearing opened with a summary of the grievance. Then Kraeth's legal representative spoke for 40 minutes. Then Petra spoke for 12 minutes, which was less time but contained considerably more specific page references. Then there was a recess. During the recess, Duvak leaned over and whispered to Petra. "How do you know it is going well?" Petra looked at the council members filing back toward the chamber. Councillor Merith took notes during my 12 minutes. She didn't take notes during their 40. Duvak processed this. And that is good. That is very good. The hearing resumed. Councillor Merith, speaking with the careful precision of someone who has made a decision and intends to make it correctly, addressed the chamber. "The council has reviewed the grievance documentation in full," she said, "including the supplementary addendum and its 216 cited sources." She paused, and the pause had a specific weight to it, the weight of 14 years of a flawed lecture being compressed into a single institutional moment. "We find that Professor Kraeth Voss's field research methodology, as applied in his second Earth expedition, did not meet the Council's standards for informed participant consent, demographic representativeness, or methodological appropriateness for the conclusions drawn. We further find that the perpetuation of these conclusions across 14 years of academic instruction, without revision in light of updated data including data published by Professor Voss himself, constitutes a breach of academic integrity standards as outlined in the Council Charter, Section 47, Subsection 9. Kraeth's legal representatives exchanged a look. Kraeth did not look at anything. He was very still. Professor Voss's lecture series on human xenobiology is suspended pending a mandatory curriculum review. His published field research from the second Earth expedition will be annotated in the academic record to reflect the methodological concerns identified in this hearing. Additionally, a formal notation will be added to his faculty record. Councillor Merath set down her notes. The council thanks the petitioner for the thoroughness of the submission. She looked at Petra. Petra looked back at her. The hearing is closed, Merath said. Outside the chamber, in the corridor with the recycled air and the carpet chosen to discourage urgency, Duvak stood beside Petra and was quiet for a long moment in the Korath way that meant he was processing something significant. You knew, he said finally. Knew what? From the first lecture. When he said 4 minutes, you knew then. Petra looked at the viewport at the end of the corridor. Stars again. Always stars. From every window on this station. I knew something was wrong with the numbers, she said. 4 minutes is fast. For a Veldrathian against trained human security personnel, in a high-stress environment, 4 minutes is very fast. The only way that number made sense was if the personnel weren't what he said they were. So you looked them up? I looked them up. Duvak made a sound that in Churath translated to something between admiration and resignation. And the 41 pages. The 41 pages were necessary. 12 would have been sufficient. 41 was thorough. Duvak looked at her. Is that a human thing? Thoroughness. Petra considered the question seriously, which she did with most questions. It's a survival thing, she said. When you come from a planet where everything is trying to kill you, you learn to pay attention to details. You learn to read the room. You learn that the thing that looks manageable is usually the thing you should be most careful about. She picked up her bag. We didn't survive a Category 7 planet by being strong. We survived it by noticing things, and remembering them and writing them down. She started walking. Duvak fell into step beside her, which required some reorganization of 6 limbs, but he managed it. Kwame Adisa, he said, after a while. Did you ever find out if he stayed in that job? He did, Petra said. He's been there 11 years. He runs the department now. Duvak was quiet again. Then, and Tomas Vara. He took up gardening after he retired. He grows tomatoes. There is a community forum where he posts photographs of them. A pause. They are very good tomatoes. Duvak processed this. You looked all of them up. Of course I did, Petra said, with the matter-of-fact simplicity of someone for whom this was the most obvious thing in the world. They were people, not data points. She pushed open the door at the end of the corridor. Somebody should know their names. The door swung shut behind them. In the formal chamber, a record was being updated. A notation was being added. A 14-year lecture was being retired. And somewhere in the galactic academic system, in the permanent public record that Petra had mentioned on day 1, in the cafeteria, over a protein composite that looked like a failed experiment, the name Kraeth Voss was being attached, permanently and irrevocably, to a mistake. Not a dramatic mistake. Not a battlefield mistake. Not the kind of mistake that gets monuments built, or songs written, or cautionary tales told around ship fuel fires. Just a quiet, thorough, 41-page mistake. The kind that lasts, the kind that a human girl with a notebook and a very fast reading speed had decided from the 3rd row of a lecture hall was worth the trouble. It always is, with humans. That is the thing about them that everyone keeps forgetting, and everyone keeps being reminded of. Not the strength, not the endurance, not the pain tolerance, or the skeletal structure, or the 4-minute field research that never quite held up under scrutiny. The noticing, the remembering, the writing it down.